The rocks cry out, pointing to God, pointing to God's judgment on the earth. So show my hand. I do believe there's a flood, and the rocks point to God's global catastrophic judgment. And this was a pivot point for me when I saw this. But when I understood that there was a flood, the rocks demonstrate that, I was humbled. So what we're going to look at are these basic areas, and hopefully you have this in front of you. You don't have any blanks, maybe a few spots if you wanted to jot some of your own notes down as well, that's fine. We're going to look here, why should you care about the Grand Canyon? And a few basic facts. I think you should know a little bit about one of the most important world wonders. I don't know what number it is. Maybe someone does. If you do or find it, you can shout it out. But it's definitely in the top 10 of world wonders. And there's no wonder why it is, because it's a massive, beautiful chasm you can see even from space. And so then I'm gonna talk a little bit about the overview of my trip. I'm gonna release another video in maybe a week or two that'll have some of my rafting videos and interviews at the bottom of the canyon and the top of the canyon with my friend Nate Loper, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're gonna look at the secular view of the canyon, of how it was formed, and then the biblical creation or flood geology view. And then we'll talk about how that all ties in together to end our time today. So this is one of the pictures I took, and I was on the raft, so I did have it in a little bag. So it's not as clear as some others, but I think this is a beautiful picture. It was about our second day on the river. But why should you care about the Grand Canyon? Well, one of the clear reasons I would say is it's very much connected to this question of, well, when did death and suffering and evil enter the world? Because beyond just trying to talk about just age of the earth and so on, that's connected only insofar as it's connected with when was death in the world. And I want you to think through this. And I've done several other classes where we parse it through more, because Genesis 3 says that's where the fall happened, right? And Romans 5:12 says through one man death entered the world, through Adam and Eve. And then the second Adam was Jesus. And so we think about connection, because why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Because death is the wages of sin, right? And so that means we're talking about, what's the time period? Did we have death before Jesus? And we're not talking about plants and creatures that don't have some kind of nephesh soul. Like there's an animal soul, which is different, but then humans alone are made in the image of God. Leviticus 17:11 talks about the life is in the blood. So there was temporary payment for sin. Hebrews talks about through animal sacrifice, but it can never truly atone for sin. Only Jesus could in his once for all sacrifice. So we'd say, according to scriptures, there's death is the result of the fall, the Adam and Eve rebelling. But if you have death before, and then you start thinking, well, is God calling death good? Because after every day, he said it was very good in morning and evening, and then it has a number on that. And that's primarily the biggest issue. Before someone gets hung up on numbers and timeline, I want you to understand that's the reason why a lot of this matters. Because a lot of people look at the Grand Canyon and say, this is a record of a lot of death and burial before humans. But then what does that say about the character of God? God's calling death good, right? He's calling evil good. But then Romans says all creation was subjected to the fall, right? And hopefully you guys see it's connected with the character of God, but it's also connected with the foundation of the gospel, that death is the result of the fall. And I want to make sure everyone really gets that. It's death, evil, suffering is not good, and it didn't come before the fall. And that's a lot of it is why we'd say it's very foundational to Scripture. Now, can someone deny the global flood and say, well, I think there was millions of years of death before Adam and Eve, and still be a Christian? Certainly. And sometimes people don't understand that we could make that distinction and say, well, you guys are just saying you're not a Christian unless you believe in the same exact timeline and believe in everything about Genesis. Unfortunately, I don't know, like really, I can't think maybe if even one biblical creationist who genuinely argues that. Maybe there's one out there, but they can say you can deny Genesis, you can deny the flood, you can say that there was death before, and still be a Christian. It's just inconsistent. And hopefully that makes sense, because essential to salvation is faith alone in Christ alone, by grace alone, to the glory of God alone. And God gets all the credit. Salvation is a gift. And of course, as Pastor Sam taught on recently, we have to believe in the right Jesus, not the Mormon Jesus. We have to Jesus is truly God, truly man, and that we are a sinner. So there are essentials of the faith, absolutely. Though I think with the desire for unity, sometimes we can undercut that there are core doctrines that if you deny this, it could be really detrimental to your own walk with the Lord and the health of the church. Like, for example, you could deny that Scripture is inspired by God, but it has a spiritual truth, but it's not really ultimately fully inspired. You maybe have kind of a different view, and you could still be saved. But do you think that would be detrimental to your walk with the Lord? If you're like, I kind of need it, maybe 50% of Scripture, it would be detrimental, right? But you could still be saved. And even the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy says that. They said you couldn't deny that without serious dangers. And so I think we should be careful from just saying the emphasis of just mere Christianity, which, of course, that title came a lot from C.S. Lewis' book. But a lot of it is the idea of like, well, let's just only agree on essentials and other things are not really important. So, of course, there's essential and there's not essential, like gifts of the Spirit, views of the end time, eschatology. You could have disagreement and still be a genuine believer. Like we have people, I think, that are pre-mill, all-mill, post-mill, but we're all believers, and we understand Jesus wins in the end. But I would say this is a foundational issue related to the foundation of the gospel, as I said. Hopefully that makes sense, that distinction, because sometimes people can't get past that alone if I don't make that distinction. And so I put on here, it's not essential for salvation to believe the above, what I just stated, but it does undercut the gospel to reverse the above order. And Psalms 11:3 says, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? So it becomes a happy inconsistency. And, that was kind of what it was with my life. I didn't think there was a flood, and I didn't think I could trust that Genesis was history when I was finishing up undergrad and my youth ministry degree. But I'll tell you, as I said before, when I did a class on progressive Christianity, is not everyone that rejects Genesis as history is progressive, but every progressive rejects Genesis as history. Hopefully that makes sense. It sounds confusing. Every person who said, well, the view of marriage, the view of sin, we're not really sinful, marriage isn't really between a man and woman, it's very much connected with rejecting Genesis as true history, right? Because if Adam didn't truly live, he didn't truly die, then Jesus literally didn't truly need to come, because it's very connected, as Romans 5:12 unpacks here. But we see here as well that people deny, or that err, for two main reasons. And Jesus connects this here a lot, where he's saying, if you can't believe earthly things, in John 3:12, then how can you believe when I talk about heavenly things? So he's not saying there's two different types of truth. They're just truth. But he's talking about truth as it relates to, say, history and things of the world. And he was talking to Nicodemus about a good logic on, well, you have to be born again. And he was talking about, you can't believe this logical thing I'm saying here, then you're going to have a hard time with this other spiritual truth. Now, Jesus said in Matthew 22:29, he said, people err for two reasons. And I can almost guarantee many of us are not thinking, well, maybe my family member, my friend, their two biggest problems are these. But here's what Jesus says. They don't know the scriptures and they don't know the power of God. But you could be like, well, but they have problems with this. Well, yeah, they all flow down from that, right? If they don't know the scriptures, like truly know the scriptures, it's not like, oh yeah, I know there's a God and I know it talks about Jesus, but like they don't really know the scriptures as they ought. And Jesus says to know scriptures as we ought to, it leads us to worship him. That's the goal of learning, right? It's not just fill our head and be like, oh, I'm so much smarter than you. It's to truly humble us and realize, man, Jesus is worth worshiping in all fields of knowledge, right? And so that's the goal of knowing the scriptures and knowing the power of God. And if that's the case, any person you talk to, that's going to be their issue. And so 1 Thessalonians talks about testing all ideas. And Colossians says, don't be taken in by fine-sounding ideas. Colossians 2:4. And so we think about, okay, well, how do we unpack that more? Well, we see in 2 Peter 3 through 6, it says, above all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, well, where's this coming? He promised. Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately ignore this fact that by the word of God, heavens existed long ago, and an earth formed out of water, and by means of water, through which the world that then exists was deluged with water and perished. So there's two big things there. He's talking about they don't know the scriptures and the power of God, and it's unpacked further here. It's they deliberately ignore what? What two things? Sorry? Yeah, the fact of what?
That the word of God existed long ago.
Right, and that by the word of God, the heavens existed, meaning he was talking about creation, right? Mm-hmm. And so they deny creation, and then what's the second thing, according to this scripture?
The flood.
They deny the flood, and that's denying scripture and the power of God. And you know, when I was out on the street the other day, and someone was saying, well, morality is just made up. Religion's made up by man. And so I don't always ask this question, but I said, do you think there was a global flood? And she's like, well, I don't know. I was like, have you heard of the book Genesis? She's like, no, I haven't. And so I shared with her someone I'm going to share with you in a little bit. And the conversation changed completely. It was like, wow, and it paved right into the gospel. And so the flood is very much connected with this issue, because why are they denying the return of Christ? Because they're denying creation and the flood. And they're very much interconnected, as we see right here. So as I said, all of the learning about history, science, astronomy, geology, all of that is intended to lead us to worship Christ. Is Colossians 1:15 and 16 saying, in him all things hold together, and he has, so that he might be the firstborn, the preeminent one over all creation. And the goal is that we would lead to reflect and honor and glorify God. And you see Jesus saying in John 5:39 is, you search the scriptures so that you may have life. But then he says later that if you truly were, you would be coming to me. If you were truly studying them rightly. So then Jesus saying, if I've spoken to you of earthly things and you do not believe, how then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? And that's why it's really connected. It's foundational, I think, in evangelism, but not only for paving the way or removing obstacles, but also helping people be discipled and grow in a biblical worldview and loving the Lord God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. He said, if you believed in Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. You know, Jesus hung a lot of the authority of his words on the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so that's very significant. And I think we should, I prefer to say I'm a whole Bible Christian rather than just mere Christian, because we're affirming that all scripture is God-breathed and useful and profitable for teaching, training, rebuking, and growing in righteousness, 2 Timothy 3:16. So again, you're in error because you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. And you see many times, and I listed several scriptures. I'm not going to go through all of them because I want to get to the rocks. But we're grounding this foundation of the talk as also the foundation for why Genesis and the flood matters. As just as in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. So you actually have a lot of New Testament figures like Jesus, the apostles, talking about the flood as it's a real historical event. So if you're going to say you believe in the New Testament, but not what they're saying here, so then you must be saying they're not telling the truth, or they mean it in some other way, that it gets really difficult to start approaching it that way. But if you see, look through all the scriptures I have there in your notes, is that we have this connection here with the New Testament authors affirm it as literal true history. Now, this is my buddy Nate Loper. He's the director of Canyon Ministries. He invited me to come out on the river tour, and he's just a great godly guy, very patient, because I ask him a million questions every day, and he's probably going to watch this video later and laugh. But this was us on the first day when we were about to get on the river boats, giant raft boats, and it's probably about right here to that table in the back there, how long they are. So very long. So that was Sunday. I drove up Friday and then Saturday, and I'll go walk through that chronology here in a little bit. But you can see why I'm so excited, and many on this trip are, is because I think what they put together and why they understood is we understand we're not just looking at rocks. we're looking at something way more than just a simple rock. And that's why we look at it, because we're looking at this question. Well, which account of history is true? Because there's an account, I'll unpack some more, but that really comes down to these two views: uniformitarianism or catastrophism. So uniformitarianism has not been around for a super long time. And so just because the idea is new doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it's interesting to know. So around 1850, the view began to develop, which argued that slow and gradual processes with uniform rates and intensities were responsible for Earth's geologic features. So it's a simple way I think I have here is the present is the key to the past. So we see the present rates of deposition, of erosion. If we just calculate back with that present rate, then we could come up with the age and the timeline, right? Does that make sense? And so that would be what we call uniformitarianism. And it's an assumption about the past. So catastrophism, if you could guess, what do you think that is? What's that's about? Yeah, and it's explaining that a very significant catastrophe would explain what we're looking at today. So the past is the key to the present. So it's the reverse, right? It's not saying that there hasn't been some recent erosion or that we disregard that, but it's primarily an interpretive grid of history. And it comes down to another way of there was no flood or there was a flood, if that's an easier way to think through it. But so we would say the global flood year, not just 40 days. Some people straw man that and say everything in 40 days. No, it was a flood year. The whole event happened. We're basically looking at that here. So James Hutton, he was also known as anti-catastrophism, called the uniformity of causes argument, argued that sedimentary rocks are the result of cyclic processes of decay and rejuvenation. So he influenced guys like Charles Lyell, who influenced Darwin. And they came a little before Darwin. And it's important to understand that that was part of the assumption before we get to Darwin as well, is that we're going, okay, we're rejecting the flood. And that was, I believe it was Charles Lyell. He says, I want to free geology from Moses. And does it necessarily mean his conclusions are absolutely wrong? Not really, but I think it's important to know that he's not neutral when he's looking at these issues. Everyone has a bias. The issue is our bias consistent within itself, and does it conform to the data, right? And so Charles Lyell influenced Charles Darwin, and that's where you see a lot of this background. And it's really important because the deep time is necessary in order for evolution to happen. And so it comes down to these views again. We have millions of years of death, pain, killing, disease, and so on. If it was just a local flood or no flood at all, you have to explain that issue. What are we looking at when we look at the fossil? Is it is a lot of death before Adam and Eve, or is it death after Adam and Eve? And so evolution or theistic evolution would both hold to that position. And so another way to put it too is evolution has, of course, the assumption on the timeline with the fossil record, what we're looking at, but it's many time periods. And the creation perspective would be creation rocks, and we'll repeat that again to make sure you get it. Creation rocks and then flood rocks. And so that would be a record of the burial in the flood stage rather than a record of evolution in the layers, rather. Does that make sense? And we'll hit that again to make sure you guys get that. And so this is from this book that we got on the tour, this little booklet we had on the river tour. Grand Canyon, what's the biblical message? If the millions of years model is correct, one should expect to find supporting evidence all around us in the world today. You would not expect to find geological or continental proportions, but rather relatively small formations created by local or regional events. The slow, gradual uniformitarian processes should be evident everywhere in the geologic record. The fossil record should contain abundant evidence of the transitions from the body plan of one kind to the next, and biological systems should show a steady progression of simple to complex life forms. So why is the geology of the Grand Canyon often in the center of the creation-evolution debate? It is because geology is the foundation of evolution. Without millions of years in the geological record, the entire evolutionary model falls apart. But adding millions of years to the Bible undermines the authority of the Word of God. If the accounts in Genesis, which are foundational to the entire Bible, are not true, then why should we believe the rest? And that's where many progressives go. Well, if that's not true, like I kind of just the origin story does matter. Without millions of years, man is then forced to consider a creator to whom he just may be accountable, a creator who tells us in Psalms 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God and the firmament proclaim his handiwork. So I think that sums up well why it's so important here. Yes, do you have a question?
Oh, I'm just saying that the Lyle guy who wanted to extricate it from Moses, just his whole thing is, well, if Moses didn't exist, the law didn't exist, and I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, and that's a great observation, and that's why I say I don't always talk about the flood and my street evangelism, but when I do, I've always found it really fruitful because they notice this point here that you're forced to consider creator because the other conclusion isn't even possible. You don't have the time anymore because a lot of the assumptions of deep time are related to the layers are dated by the fossils, but also the problem herein lies that the fossils are dated by the layers, which is circular reasoning. And I'm not covering all of carbon-14. There's other material I continue on that, but there are some difficulties in the assumptions there as well. And those are documented by people on both sides of the spectrum. But let's do a couple facts about the Grand Canyon and move on here. Is 277 miles long, 18 miles wide at its widest point. So I'm not sure if that's exactly the south rim where most people drive in, but that seems like it's one of the wider points, like some of the pictures I'll show you. It's some places it's over a mile deep and 10 miles across, which is amazing. And 1,904 square miles. It's bigger than the entire state of Rhode Island. Not that it takes that much, but Native Americans around the area have many flood legends that describe the carving of the Grand Canyon. And many we'll talk about later, I'll mention in passing, is that they have an origin story, or they have a flood legend, a global flood legend. It looks a little different, but many of the Native Americans that have a supai have some kind of flood story. The Grand Canyon is the most famous, but there are several other actually a little deeper. Cotahuasi Canyon in Peru and the Kali Gandakaya Gorge in Nepal and Copper Canyon system, Mexico. Now that's like the systems of canyons. Now the Grand Canyon itself is bigger in one sense, but then the canyon system in Mexico is bigger. But Grand Canyon, my understanding, it's easier to do research there because of the way it's laid out, and so it's the geology hotspot in the world. So here's part of my trip. It was 6 days in total, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I'm going to release another video where I have rim interviews and at the bottom of the canyon. But I want to just give you a highlight and then want to talk about like, okay, let's put the pieces together. How is this really connected with the flood and so on? So I traveled up to Vegas Friday, went to the ranch, and then day 3 through 5, I was down in the canyon. And then the last day I was on the rim and went to an old volcano. So I'll show you a couple things here. And here's me getting up at like 4:30 in the morning, and you'll see a video of me talking here and just super excited. It was really hard to wake up. Well, actually, it wasn't that hard to wake up. I was excited to go. And this is the book I got there the first night.
Some secular geologists will say that the Grand Canyon slowly formed around 70 million years ago,
because
all
actually
the way
it's very
up to
it's
around
very
6
close to
million
where we
years
enter
ago.
the canyon. If you look at Las Vegas, so I met with my friend Nate, and then we talked about creation and just it was awesome fellowship. And so then the next day we fly out to what's called the Bartoon Ranch. So it's on the north rim of the Grand Canyon on the west side. And so here's me us flying here, and this was before I got sick. I didn't realize I could get really seasick when I was in the Philippines, and I could get really sick on this plane. If it was 5 more minutes, I would have hurled, and I didn't know later that I was in a plane with several other pilots. Well, that makes sense why they were judging me. But they were really great guys. And here's us on the plane here. And so at the ranch, just really neat, just place before we go into the canyon, skeet shooting and riding horses, and just great meals. And then we had entertainment by the ranch host, and it was the best entertainment within 70 miles because it's the only entertainment within 70 miles. And it was a great time. And actually, it was just amazing going there. But the way they do it, it's really ideal, I think, because hiking down the canyon is quite the chore. So where we go, the ranch, it's really close to where the next day we're going to fly in. It's about a 6-minute helicopter flight to the bottom. It's like at mile 188 of the Grand Canyon. So this is called a lower river trip. And so it's called Whitmore Wash, where we landed at. And so here's a highlight of some of the things. We saw some Indian petroglyphs and stopped at a couple spots. And I'll show you guys those here in a little bit. And here's some of those petroglyphs. And we believe a biblical creation model that, after the Tower of Babel, a lot of people dispersed around the world, and some Native Americans ended up around the Grand Canyon area. And so we have underwater land bridges from like Alaska. Water level is lower. Before the end of the ice age, it's totally doable for that. But what we see is we saw a lot of the lava flows on that side of the canyon on the lower river as well. And here's a petroglyph and the difference between a pictograph, if you care to know the difference. Petroglyphs carved in incised and scratched in stone. A pictograph is a painting on stone using natural pigments. So I hope I'm right that these are petroglyphs. So that was all Sunday. And I'll highlight a couple other things here. Actually, Sunday, we did see the Great Unconformity as well. And I'm going to talk about that. That's really, really huge. Monday, I led the morning devotional, and we got to hear more of the Native American stories connected with the flood. And I got to jump off of a cliff. And I didn't die, in case you're wondering. So I'll show you guys a video of that later on YouTube. And the rapids that day were actually crazy. Like I almost got knocked off several times. But I was holding on for my dear life. But in the evening, I wish you could see this picture here with it's the stars at night. And one of the guys had a really good night vision camera, and it just looked incredible. Because we would look at the stars, and he had one of those laser pointers that looks like a lightsaber, and we were just talking about the stars and its connection with God's creation, and that's what Psalms 19 says. They declare the glory of God. And we also noticed that if you put a black light on a scorpion, they glow in the dark. And it's awesome. This one was like that big. It was like a monster. And so then after that, we're like, how am I supposed to go to sleep? We slept on cots, and they say they can't climb up the cots. But I don't know. Maybe I ate one in my sleep, and I wasn't aware. And so the last day, we went to the Travertine Grotto Falls. And that's this carbonate deposit over there, and it kind of this little like waterfall area, and was really awesome. And then we kind of finished out the raft tour. It's the shorter trip. They do that's technically about 3-4 days on the boat, and they do longer ones on the upper river. But that's the kind of the little highlight, a brief overview. I'm going to talk about, well, what are some of those significant things we saw here? And we had 2 boats for a whole team here, and that's me climbing up in that waterfall area. But we were looking at, when in the boats, we saw a lot of features, and kind of ended our week together. Really hot. That sand would burn your feet. I think everyone, by the end, we said, not everyone gets to go down the Grand Canyon. Many go to the rim. But going down the Grand Canyon and seeing it from a biblical creation perspective is a blessing and a privilege. And we feel a responsibility to share with others. And that's what I'm doing here today, of some of the things we learned. And I want to highlight those here, because when you see it, and you put these together, I think it's very exciting. And after I went out there, I went to the rim and went to that old volcano I mentioned about and filmed some videos. And here's that Red Mountain volcano. And here's Nate and I at the rim. And here's me close to the edge. Actually, it wasn't a straight drop off right there. But some of these pictures, like this one right here, this is really, really, really important, what you're looking at here. I'm going to explain that more here in a little bit. Now, the basic secular explanation for the Grand Canyon and the layers and formation, there's a lot more, and I've done videos with Nate on YouTube that are a lot longer than I have time for today, so it's nice you can check those out. But they're saying here, 6 million years old, the canyon, and it was primarily, a lot of them will promote that it was carved by the Colorado River. Now, you have a couple interesting things with this. Some of them will have different views, and I won't bog you down with the technical names of it, but the issue is the Grand Canyon sits in this big uplifted area called the Colorado Plateau, which is like 3,000 feet higher than where the Colorado River enters the plateau. And so you have the Grand Canyon in this little spot. So they go, well, was it cutting the river? Was it being uplifted the same time it was cutting it? And there's not this pure speculation because do rivers flow uphill? No, because normally it would go around. And many even secular geologists are claiming, no, the Colorado Plateau was uplifted before the Grand Canyon was carved. They just have a different timeline assumption. But there's coming in a lot of problems. They haven't changed their signs here, but the Colorado River carving the canyon, you have problems because it'd have to flow uphill and it'd have to be going at the same time and eroding it at the same time as well. Besides the issue we'll look at later that it does like a 90-degree turn in the middle of the canyon as well. But you see these, they're talking about uplift. There would be no Grand Canyon, kind of like what I'm talking about, right? And so they're making some assumptions on where the timeline fits and how the Colorado River would fit into this as well. So we're seeing here really it's slow deposition, rising and falling oceans over multiple times over this area at least, rising and falling oceans. In some of the layers they think are wind blown. We'll look at that in a later here in a little bit. That it's just wind blown and not laid down by water, and the river cut it. And they're talking about different radioisotope and radiometric dating. That are saying, well, maybe that proves that this is the deeper you go down, the more million years. And they have this walk of time that's like every step's like a million years, representing this walkway here on the rim. So they look at the fossil record. Again, I said they're looking at the fossil record. They're saying, is that a record of life, meaning evolving from a simple to complex organism, or is it a record of burial, of death? Does that make sense? And that's very, very abbreviated on the Grand Canyon view, but a lot have been promoting Colorado River or river antecedent and other views related to that. It's kind of falling out of favor with even many non-believer secular geologists. So a basic flood geology explanation here is that we have creation rocks, and I'm going to explain this more in a little bit, but you see this bottom area where it's kind of like sheared off and it's a different angle from the rest, and the others are stacked up straight. That contact between the Tepete sandstone and the bottom, we would say that's the beginning of the flood, and then there's a massive erosion on the bottom. So we'd say those are originally creation rocks, and these top ones were like jumbled around and laid down again, laid down during the flood year. And so I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but basically that's what we're looking at is the beginning of flood from Tepete all the way to Kaibab, and we have flood layers even higher than the Grand Canyon as well. And so then we have flood recession when the floodwaters are draining, which means if we're putting this in the big picture, the floodwaters are draining, we're going to see massive erosional remnants or relics, they say in geology, or we'll see things, or we should expect things like sheet erosion. If you've sat on the shore of an ocean and you see kind of this layer and it just pulls off this whole layer of it, that's like on a small scale when you're on the beach or something, you guys know what I mean? And it just pulls off, and they call it like sheet erosion. So we should expect a massive sheet erosion of layers. And we actually see that the layers above the Grand Canyon, they're missing. About 10,000 feet above the Grand Canyon is missing, called the Grand Staircase. And so then we have post-flood rocks, where after the flood year, different things that have happened after that, but it's not as significant as this pancake layer stacked above from the Tepetes and all the way up. And here's also what we find interesting is we don't find megascopic fossils in this area right here. You may find like small little like algae-like type of fossils that are like in a small slow-moving area. But you don't find anything significant until you get to Tepete. And so the evolutionists call that the Great Cambrian Explosion. It looks like there's an explosion of life. And we'd say this is the beginning of the flood. And that kind of makes sense, right? We're just interpreting it a different model. Does everybody get that? And so we start to see a lot of fossils from the Tepete sandstone all the way up. So if you were able to see the Tepete sandstone in person, wouldn't that be pretty neat? And that's exactly what I was able to do. And I'll show you guys a picture of it here in a second. But you see, here's the Grand Canyon. But look at that. There's these layers right above the Grand Canyon. This is what we call the Grand Staircase: Chocolate Cliffs, Vermilion, White Cliffs, Zion Canyon, Bryce Canyon. But a lot of geologists are going, okay, what happened to the rest of it? Originally, it probably was covering the rest of the area. And we'll look at that here in a little bit because we see some of the erosion, the sheet erosion. Imagine if it just pulled all of those layers off. Well, it did. And it have to be something very catastrophic for them to be pulled off and end up right around like south of Texas in the Gulf. And because if it was just a rising and falling and not a catastrophic sheet erosion, you wouldn't find them way away from the Grand Staircase over there. So those are some of the things we expect: flood layers, flood recession, and sheet erosion, and different things being left over. So this is the exciting part for me, and I think this will be for you. And we're just going to give you a little overview of these are the type of things we should expect: evidence of ocean waters flooding over the continents, rapid burial, widespread and rapidly deposited layers, a long distance of sediment transport from one area. Say we're going to look at one came from the Appalachian Mountains all the way around northern Arizona, and a rapid or no erosion between the rock layers in rapid succession. And because if each layer represents millions of years, then we should see evidence of life happening for that chunk of time. And then we'll see things of, like, I'll show you briefly the flood legends. So the ocean waters flooding over the continents. That's what we see around the Tapete Sandstone, the beginning of the flood. That's what we would expect because those are the first things, the beginning of the flood, that would be fossilized. But also keep in mind, like, the bottom of the ocean isn't a great environment for fossils forming because you have scavengers, right? And so I like to think of it real simple as floods form fossils fast. Because if it's laying there and there's nothing to mess with it, that's one thing to form a fossil. But if you have flood happening rapidly, catastrophically, sediment happening, being laid down upon it, then it's going to form ocean fossils. And, you know, most of the fossil record are marine fossils. And we were mentioning earlier, we find them on top of mountains, the Alps, Andes, Everest. We're talking about marine fossils up there. And so that does point to something. We can't say this is just crazy anti-science creationists. There is something going on. The issue is, how do we explain the data? What's the mechanism for this? And it's widespread. You know, it's funny that I've been doing research also on dinosaurs. And some people say, well, there's an asteroid in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. But then the issue is, even if there was one, it's way too far away from the Morrison Formation up northern, away from Texas, Mexico, Gulf, and it was too far north that it could have impacted them. What we actually see is a massive burial area of many dinosaurs. It's like they died rapidly. And what a lot of even secular geologists, basically what they're saying is, at this point, they're saying, well, they died in a flood here, and they died in a flood here, and they died in a flood here. There's floods everywhere. So it sounds like a global catastrophic flood, right? They just don't want to make that last connection. They say most of the dinosaurs died in a local flood, locally all over the world. And so most of the fossil record is marine invertebrates, primarily shellfish, and the rest of the 5% are plants. And then most are insects, and a lot, maybe less than 1% are land vertebrates. So we're finding a lot of dinosaurs, but you think of that number that we're finding, particularly the Morrison Formation, doesn't even compare to the marine fossils. And that's pretty much what we expect anyways. Rapid burial of creatures. This is one of my favorite ones because we would expect to find a rapid burial as we're going up if these layers, Tapetes on up, represent the beginning on the flood. And we actually find fossils like a fish eating another fish. Was it eating it for millions of years? There was a catastrophe. Now, some may say, well, it was a local flood. The problem is we find these almost globally. Fish buried while giving birth. When we find this all around together, we just need to make that connection. Fossilized jellyfish in Australia. That's like trying to nail down water. So something very rapid and catastrophic was fossilizing a jellyfish. You find a lot of these suffocating positions of dinosaurs. Many burial beds. Now, burial beds is really important because we're not just talking about like, yeah, there's a couple and then the rest ran away. We're talking about many were buried at once. And so it's like a group's together and you find 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs running and they even leave their children and they're all adult dinosaurs buried together. That tells you something catastrophic was happening. We find nautiloid fossils found in the Redwall limestone. And this is covering 10,500 square miles. And they're all different sizes of nautiloids and ages. So it again sounds like there was a catastrophe. In some areas, you find some of them like facing the same direction. So it's going to be hard if you're going to say that was happening over deep time and the red wall limestone layer. It sounds like something rapidly happened here. And you find even birds and bees buried together from different environments, animals mixed in together from different environments. So you would think if there was a lot of time and maybe they wouldn't be mixed in and buried together. How could this have happened if the ocean waters rose and swept over the continents in a global catastrophic flood? That's, I'd say, the best explanation. So many marine creatures had to catastrophically be buried. Large ammonites and other marine creatures in chalk beds in Britain. We see all those in Britain as well, Middle East, United States, forming these massive fossil graveyards. And even in Antarctica. This is Dr. Andrew Snelling, one of the leading creation geologists in the world.
So another fascinating demonstration of the flood, of the rapid burial of creatures, is this display right here in this picture of these animal tracks, these reptile footprints that are displayed on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. They were cut out from the Coconino sandstone, and they're displayed right here. And we can see them actually going up at an angle. Even the park geologists will admit that we only find them going up an angle in the sand dunes or in the Grand Canyon, but we never find them going downhill. However, that's an interesting issue, because if the Coconino sandstone was allegedly around for, say, 5 million years, then why do we not find their footprints going down any dunes? It seems that a better explanation is that during the rising floodwaters, while they were trying to get to safe ground, their bodies were picked up and carried to another sand dune as they were trying to escape. To make matters worse, if this layer was around for 5 million years or more, why do we not find the bodies of those same animals in the same layer? In fact, we don't find any fossils of these animals until we get to the Chinle Formation right above. And you see here in this picture is the Coconino sandstone, and then several layers up above the Grand Canyon, we see the Chinle Formation. That's amazing. It doesn't make any sense to say that these animals lived for millions of years, yet their bodies were not buried in the same layer that they lived in all that time, unless their bodies were picked up and buried in a higher layer during the flood year.
So we're going to move on here to this widespread and rapidly deposited rock layers. This is one of my favorites. So again, we're saying that Tapete sandstone is where the flood started. And you know the Tapete sandstone here on the left, we're looking at the Grand Canyon. On the right is the same sandstone in southern Israel. That tells you something, right? This is not just a localized flood. This is a global catastrophic transcontinental flood. It's in northern Africa, Europe, Israel. That's very close to where David probably got the rock to kill Goliath. It's called the Nubian sandstone, but it's the same type of sandstone, different name in northern America. So fascinating that David was right there, right close to flood rocks, and that was widespread all the way over here. Because we believe the Grand Canyon layers were laid down during the flood year, but the cutting of the canyon happened later. And here's another model here showing that yellow layer. That's the Tapete sandstone. So you see it going in Israel, North Africa, and North America as well. Isn't that exciting?
That is.
When you see that and you're like, well, if I'm touching the Tapete sandstone, I'm touching the beginning of God's judgment, if you will. So, and so there's actually, I don't have time to cover, they say like 6 mega sequence. Dr. Tim Clary is trying to catalog those all around, the mega sequence of several layers and groups all around the world. So interesting research coming out on that. And so here's some of his highlights of these sequences being laid over the world, kind of like laying down peanut butter. So it's not that you'd expect it to brick down, but it's going to be layered over all around the continental area. So we see these different layers in the Grand Canyon. I'm not going to talk through all of these, but I'll highlight a few of them here and why they're significant. So these layers, if we're looking at them, we see it looks like it was kind of cut off clean, right? Well, that's what we're talking about when we're looking at the carving of it. But also we don't see massive erosion between the layers. So it sounds like they were just being stacked upon each other fairly fast. But if each of these layers represent millions of years, as each of the signs are saying, then we should expect to see evidence of plant life, insect life, and so on going through there. And we'd call that bioturbation, meaning the reworking of soils and sediments by animals, plants. And so burrowing and ingestion, defecation of sediments, we actually see a lack of that which means, what do you think that means?
It wasn't.
It happened rapidly, right? If we're seeing lack of bioturbation, that's kind of an interesting problem. If each of these layers represent this deep time. Now, this is one of my favorite things. Crossbeds, they're these angled layers here, and they're fossilized layer. You see at this angle now, windblown layers will go at 33 degrees. Take a protractor, you find 33 degrees, like white sands. Windblown layers will have a crossbed looking right around that angle, 33, 34 degrees. Water-laid crossbeds have an angle like 23, 25 degrees. And that's exactly what we find in the Coconino. Many secular geologists will say, no, you have a windblown layer in the middle of a flood. Oh, you stupid creationists, you don't know what you're talking about. And Dr. Whitmore came on my YouTube channel and he's talked about a whole hour talking about, no, the Coconino is laid in water. And actually it's in northern New Mexico, and around Christmas time, I drove up with one of my daughters just to see the crossbed because, again, it was a moment of worship. And so search for the rocks in order to worship Christ. The crossbeds point to the widespread water-laid deposits, so long distance of sediment transport. Now we see some of these layers here, and I have here, we're looking at, again, the Coconino. It's that yellow one. Looks like some people call it like a bathtub ram. It has that yellow ram right there. Now the Coconino sandstone, I think it came from Utah or Wyoming. So we're talking about a long distance transport, not as long as, say, the Navajo sandstone, just north of the Grand Canyon, coming from Oklahoma or the northern Appalachians. Now, here's an issue. If it's coming from the northern Appalachians to just north of the Grand Canyon, how did it get there? And so some secular geologists are saying, well, it was windblown, really slow, but there's no evidence for that. And you're getting a whole layer being windblown. I mean, have you seen sand being blown? And that, so it's very, I think it's grasping for straws, with all due respect. But also you see there's, you see these northeast angles, if you will, that are showing the angle of the current flow. And you're seeing it on the current flow on the Appalachians. The current flow, the part of the Grand Canyon, it was flowing that way and is going northeast, probably northeast to southwest, down to that area where we're finding the Navajo sandstone. And so that makes sense, the long distance transport. Isn't that pretty awesome? You look at these rocks and it's amazing seeing what's going on here. So here's the picture of that Navajo sandstone. I forgot to share that. So you see rapid erosion, like the Great Unconformity, or no erosion, meaning it's being stacked up rapidly.
So what we're looking at here, my left hand is what we call creation rock, and my right hand is onto Pete sandstone. And that line there is marking the Great Unconformity. And it's not conforming, it's not matching all these other layers that are stacked on top of each other like pancakes. And you notice here that it looks like something was just scraped off, and they don't fit here, these granite and schist rocks below the tapetes. So we say it was a rapid erosion and it was eroded off, and that we have some examples of giant boulders down at the bottom there where we think the beginning of the flood started, and we have these boulders that would represent like storm beds right around the beginning of the flood. So that would be our evidence for a rapid erosion near the beginning stage of the flood.
So here's the part I was excited about. It was the first day, and I was so excited. Nate's getting ready to talk, and I'm like, I got to get a video of this. I want to hear what he's going to say. I want other people to see what he's saying on my channel. And so I just jumped off to the side in these reeds, and I had my sandals on, and then I got pricked with a nice little some plant of some sort. And then I had a splinter in that foot the whole trip until I got it out like a week later, because I knew what I was looking at. So this right here, where my left hand is, that's creation rock. And where my right hand is, that's Tapete sandstone. That's the beginning of the flood, the beginning of God's judgment. So everyone got a picture like that, and he's talking about it. And the Great Unconformity is, again, it runs not in just the local area. It runs transcontinental as well. And what we see is we see these rounded off stones and the Tapete sandstone. And he said, oh, I haven't noticed this before. They were rounded off by the water, and there were several rounded in the Tapetes, because that's what water does, right? And so here's another picture of Dr. Brian Thomas with ICR looking at that. But apparently between these layers, there's supposedly 500 million years missing, because it looks different, it doesn't conform to each other, and it doesn't fit some of their assumptions. So where's the missing time? Well, we say that the time is just, it began where the flood began. And so it becomes a big enigma from a different model, and say it hurts good science when you start with bad assumptions and bad starting points. And So again, we talked about that sheet erosion already. It's just a review of all of these layers up here. On they just call the grand staircase because it kind of looks like a staircase, right? That was eroded off. So you see that massive erosion there and the massive erosion on the Great Unconformity. And then the rapid succession of rock layers. So does anybody have any idea what you're looking at? It's not a super clear picture. This layer is not straight, is it? It's bent. Now here's the really big issue here is if you were to bend concrete, if you're that strong like me, no, not really, it would crack, right? Okay, so if you bend concrete, crack, but you don't see cracks here, and should expect that if it was over millions of years. Now, if you bend concrete when it's wet, yeah, or heat, and that's actually where the debate's at, is was it laid down when it was still wet, and then during the flood recession or later part of the flood year, it was bent. And that's what Dr. Andrew Snelling has been doing research on, researching, did it change because of metamorphic processes, heating? And I know Angela's talked with me about this some before, and Dr. Snelling's testing this, and there's research that's going to come out later. It's going to be interesting to see the results about this, because I think even previously, a couple years ago, he was looking at this issue, and because you can't have millions of years of folded layer not cracking. It doesn't work. It has to be laid down when it was wet. And we see these several layers were bent together as well. And we see bent layers. Have you guys seen these in Iran?
We saw some in Iraq.
Okay. I mean, it's incredible. So I think this happened during the flood year, those bent layers there. And we see, of course, I'll just briefly hit on this, polystrate fossils, where it has trees running through several layers. Again, if the layers represent 7 million years, if the tree's sticking out above, do you think it's going to decompose? Yeah. But if the tree is laid down right around when the layers are coming down rapidly, then that's what we'd expect. And we see things like that, especially in Canada. I think it's Nova Scotia. If you want to type in polystrate fossils, creation.com, and you'll find an article on that, because it shows that these layers were laid down rapidly. If the fossilized polystrate fossil here, it couldn't have represented millions of years. That tree would have collapsed away here. Going through several strata, and you see several examples there. And here's one of my favorite ones. And this is a guy, I'm going to interview the author of this, Lord willing, a couple months of this book. It just came out a couple months ago. And this is on flood legends in North and South America, Echoes of Ararat. And now, he doesn't highlight this because this is not North and South America, but I did want to highlight this point here, that the pictograph, Chinese pictograph for boat is vessel, 8, and people. The word for garden is dust, breath, to, and closure. And there's many other pictographs. The ancient Chinese language, I think there's a book called Genesis in Chinese or something like that, that talks about this in the ancient Chinese language. And there's a guy who shared this with others in China who didn't believe in the Bible, and then he shared this, and then he eventually gave his life to Christ. He said, oh, Genesis is true, and it points to Jesus. We see flood stories. Actually, I should probably update that. It's probably over 300 flood legends. And a lot of them have key things in common. Now, it diverges on some other details, but they have core things like it was global, animals, there's a boat, forewarned, and a rainbow is not as much agreement. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. The burden of proof lies on those to explain all the flood legends, right? And you find it all in cultures all around the world. Even before, the Polynesian islands, before Maui or Tahiti became a thing, believed in one God. Monotheism is actually the original view of the most primitive cultures, not paganism or polytheism or animism. And Wilhelm Schmidt has done research on that. And that's what they find. One supreme God and global flood. And many missionaries use these details to share with other cultures who may not currently have access to the gospel, but they may have some idea of a supreme God and some connection in their story of a flood legend as well. And so here's that connection with that book. He has several articles on flood legends in the Americas. So check it out. Flood Legends, the Americas, and he has 1 through 3 articles that kind of highlight some of his things in his book. So the Grand Canyon, we believe the flood waters came down and some of the water got stuck in areas. There's massive basins, and some of the water had massive sheet erosion, pulled off the grand staircase, and it eventually drained back into the newly formed ocean. Now, some of the water, if it got trapped, and we're having a lot of volcanic activity happening, and the flood caused the ice age, which is is another talk. But the flood is a really good mechanism to cause the ice age. I can explain that more later. But we have ridiculous amount of volcanic activity going on, and massive hypercane storms going on, and these lakes being filled in. We're going to look at this question. Well, okay, did these lakes have anything to do with the carving of the Grand Canyon? So I believe maybe 700 years after the Grand Canyon layers were laid down, that it was carved near the middle to later part of the Ice Age. And it was from either this issue, a lot of time and a little water, the secular view, though there are some secular geologists who are starting to reject that because of this issue we're going to look at here in a little bit. A lot of water in a little time from a breached dam northeast of the Grand Canyon. And there's a lot of research being done on this and on this ancient lake. And so remember, Grand Canyon's on the Colorado Plateau. I talked about this earlier. So it would have to flow uphill for the river to carve it. But if there was this massive lake that would have to cut through this area of the Grand Canyon, remember, we're talking about several thousand feet, 2,800, where it enters a canyon, but then the canyon has high range. It enters in the Colorado Plateau. And so we're talking about a lot of problems with the Colorado cutting it. It doesn't flow uphill. And so here, we'll go back to this. We're saying the canyon doesn't exist because of the Colorado River. The Colorado exists because the canyon was cut. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'll explain it some more. So here's where the river flow goes. The river was already feeding into this massive lake that existed beforehand. But here's what we're talking about, this lake. And if you raise the level even higher, it probably would be one massive lake if you raise the elevation of that. And so you look at how big that is compared to the Grand Canyon. It's pretty massive. It's 3 times the size of Lake Michigan. And so we're talking about, here's the Kaibab, the highest layer there. And so you have these lakes that had different names, Canyonlands and Hopi Lake. And then we're talking about they eventually breached. They were or spilled over because they had so much water, and they breached through. And so we actually find this. Nate shared this on my channel already. This is some stuff he's yet to publish. But he finds, look at these rocks here. It's not just random rocks. These are rocks that are glued onto this rock here. And this is the kind of stuff that happens when something catastrophic, a lot of rapidly moving water is happening. Have you seen that before, Angela? And so what he has here on these rocks, they're going the right direction. Let me go back here. I think this is around the Hopi area where they would be draining down, like the whole lake was drained out, and it's facing the right direction for that. And we find, going back to this, you find evidence of the shoreline. There were maybe some of these birds around here. We find their footprints. They're around there. So it's not a made up lake. It's not some crazy creationist idea. Even secular geologists now believe a massive flash flood or have occurred in the Grand Canyon resulting from a breached lava dams, and much as a third of the canyon's depth may have been cut in the blink of a geologic eye. And they found evidence of 400,000 cubic feet per second flow that occurred about 4,000 years ago. Well, that's pretty close to when we would say the Grand Canyon was carved. And even Dr. John Douglas, not a creationist from my understanding, actually is promoting this view because you see here in your notes, because there's we find the no salt deposits left over. If it was just a slow lake, that it drained out rapidly. We find green clay, and I have that here in your notes there. And so the lake can't exist at the same time as the Grand Canyon, because if you're going to fill it up, it would just drain out to the Grand Canyon now, right? So the Grand Canyon exists because the lake has been drained out is the key issue. Okay, all this sediment, if the Grand Canyon was carved out, slowly we should expect to find like these massive river deltas like Mississippi and Egypt, right? If we're talking about, and remember, if we're talking about the Grand Canyon, it carves down and goes down to the Baja, Mexico. The Colorado River, rather, it goes down through Baja, Mexico, and then into the ocean. We should find these big river deltas if it was over millions of years of time carving it out, right? What we actually find is, so here's the Colorado River. We find the sediment like it was blasted out, and we find some of it maybe even under the LA basin. And it's like, okay, if it's not even going the right way for the Colorado River, it's not forming a river delta. That means it was carved out rapidly and catastrophically. 950 cubic miles removed sediments from the Grand Canyon. And that's what we see here on the bottom of your notes here. We expect to see a massive delta if the Colorado River covered, but we do not. And again, Jesus in John 3:12, I told you of earthly things you do not believe. How you believe I tell you of heavenly things. And if you believe Moses, you'd believe me. The foundation is destroyed. What can the righteous do? You know, Jesus says, I'm the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. Who closed the door of the ark? Noah? No, God. And who is the door of salvation? Jesus. Jesus is the greater ark. So the Grand Canyon is all pointing to the glory of God, pointing to the ultimate story of hope and rescue in Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate rescue through the ark. And I want to close with this video by Canyon Ministries. This just talking about why this is so important and so significant.
I'm John Elbert with Canyon Ministries, standing on the south rim of Grand Canyon. You know, there's roughly 6 million people from all over the world that come here to enjoy Grand Canyon. And they come to a place such as this because of the beauty that you can see behind me. This place is absolutely magnificent, stunning in color and in landscape and in texture. In fact, the landscape of our entire world has a beauty to it that we invest vast amount of time and money to go and to travel and vacation and enjoy. But when we view the Grand Canyon through a biblical perspective, we recognize that the landscape of Grand Canyon, the landscape even of our earth as a whole, it is not original creation. In fact, it is the result of this global catastrophic event described in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. But that leads to something very important for us to consider and to understand. What we're seeing here and around our world is a result of this catastrophic global event that took place during Noah's time and described in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Now, God had every right to leave the post-flood world a complete and total wasteland, but he didn't. He wove incredible beauty into that judgment, into that wrath, beauty that we see and enjoy here at Grand Canyon. But when we take just a couple of moments to consider that truth, it becomes pretty profound in what it means. First of all, if God's wrath can be this beautiful, what is heaven going to look like? It's going to make this look like an eyesore. I mean, he's creating that out of love, not out of wrath. But it's also giving us a window into the very heart of God. It's telling us a little bit about the purpose of his wrath and the purpose of his judgment. The purpose of his judgment is not to destroy, but to redeem, to make it new. And that is incredible for us to take time to think about. I mean, even the Apostle Peter tells us that Noah wasn't not just a boat builder, but he was a preacher. He was a herald of righteousness, which means the entire time he's building this boat, he's also going, come on, y'all, let's go. Let's go. The wrath of God is coming, but I got a boat. And this boat has got a door in it. And you know, if anybody at Noah's time, no matter how vile they had been, no matter what they were guilty of, and obviously it was pretty atrocious, if they would have walked through the door of that ark, they would not have been destroyed by that flood. But they rejected that message, and they rejected the door. You know, the creator of the universe is also our Redeemer. In John chapter 1, verse 14, we discover that the Word, that which created absolutely everything, became flesh and made a dwelling among us. And while Jesus was here, in John chapter 10, verse 9, he says, I am the door. And anybody that walks in through him is going to be saved. The exact same message. But the question becomes, are we going to learn from history? Or are we this time around going to say, absolutely, I'm going to walk through the door of Jesus Christ and I'm going to be made new? You know, you think about the Israelites, they wandered around for 40 years before they actually got to go into the promised land because they hadn't trusted God. And in Joshua chapter 4, we see this incredible account where they finally get to enter the promised land, but they got to cross the Jordan River. And the Jordan River is at flood stage. So the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they've got to go and they've got to put their foot in that raging river. It didn't back up first. They had to trust God that they weren't going to be swept away by that river, but put that foot in, it did. It backed up. And they stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan River, and all of Israel passes by, entering into the promised land. But before the Ark of the Covenant was allowed to leave that dry ground, God told the people, go get some rocks, and to take those rocks and to put them in a pile. And the whole purpose of that pile of rocks was a monument to what had taken place. The next generation was walking along in that same area and they saw that pile of rocks. They'd look at their mom or their dad or their uncle or whoever and say, hey, what's up with these rocks? And that was a call out to the older generation to go, let me tell you. Let me tell you about the wonders of God. Let me tell you about the awesome things that happened right here, what that means for us today and what that means for our future. Well, the same is true when people come here. When those people from all over the world travel here to Grand Canyon and look out here, you can't help but look out there and go, well, what's up with the rocks? And when that question's asked, we, God's people, are supposed to have the humility and the courage to stand up and say, let me tell you. Let me tell you about the wonders of God. Let me tell you about the majesty of God and what this landscape means. The truth that God absolutely is going to defend His holiness. He is going to judge sin, but He is a God who redeems, wants you to be made new. He is a God that takes something that is broken and fallen apart and has rebelled against Him, and He makes it a brand new creation. The old is gone, and the new has come. That's what God does. That's what this landscape is proclaiming. So when we just take a breath for a moment and look at the landscape of Grand Canyon through the lens of Scripture, we quickly realize that this is not just a canyon. This is a monument to the heart of God, a God who wants you to be made new, a God who came in the flesh into our world to save us and has given us a door of Jesus Christ to walk through so that we could be made new. It's not just a canyon, it's the gospel.
Great video to end on. I want to encourage you guys to check out, if you have not, these movies, is Genesis History. It's free on YouTube. Great movie to watch your family and kids. And they're coming out with a new one now. And these may answer more of your follow-up questions. Next year is Genesis History, Mountains After the Flood. So I'm really excited about that. And encourage you guys to share what you learned today. And that's why I have a one-page thing. Share something you learned with someone. I encourage you at lunch or someone in your family, just share that one thing and share how it connects to the gospel.